He threw a punch at every hand that tried to save him. Captain Ethan Mercer, decorated Marine commander, survivor of the deadliest covert operation in a decade, lay bleeding on a gurney in Houston, Texas, fighting doctors, nurses, and security like enemy combatants. No sedative could reach him. No voice could break through. His mind was trapped 7,000 miles away in a building that had already collapsed. Then a quiet nurse, the one everybody ignored, the one with the red "New Staff" sticker on her badge, stepped forward. She whispered 6 words, and the most dangerous man in that emergency room went completely still. If this story moves you, I'd love for you to subscribe, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels. The call came in at 9:14 on a Thursday night. Male, mid-30s, GSW right shoulder with blast involvement. Vitals tanking. Name, Captain Ethan, Marine Corps. The triage nurse slammed the code button. That harsh alarm stabbed through St. Gabriel Medical Center's emergency department, and everything changed in a heartbeat. Conversations died. Coffee cups hit counters. Feet moved faster. Someone yanked a curtain aside so hard the rings cracked against the metal rail like a gunshot. 2 paramedics shoved the gurney through the automatic doors. One wheel squealed against the wet floor. The man on the stretcher was big, the kind of big that came from years of carrying weight no civilian gym could replicate. But his muscles had gone slack. His tactical shirt was shredded. Blood soaked through the fabric in a dark, spreading shine. There was a patch still clinging to his shoulder, torn at one corner, hanging on by threads. "BP 80/50 and falling," the lead medic called out, already breathing hard. "We got fluids running, but he needs a miracle or a surgeon." "I am the miracle." Dr. Victor Lang pushed through the crowd. Mid-40s, silver threading through his hair in deliberate lines, lab coat open, stethoscope draped around his neck like jewelry. He moved like the room belonged to him, because in his mind, it did. "Get him on monitors, CBC, type and cross, full trauma panel, respiratory, stay close. We might need to intubate." Hands moved. Clips snapped onto skin. The heart monitor exploded to life. Green spikes, erratic, angry, but present. An oxygen mask hissed as it settled over Ethan's mouth. Someone cut away the rest of his shirt. And that's when Grace Dalton saw him. She was halfway through restocking a supply cart when the alarm had sounded. 6 weeks into her civilian nursing career, 6 weeks of smiling at jokes about how she should stick to the easy stuff. 6 weeks of swallowing everything she knew and pretending she was learning it for the first time. Her badge read, "Grace Dalton, RN." Underneath a small red sticker, "New Staff." She stepped closer to Trauma 2 and looked through the gap in the curtain. The smell hit her before anything else. Copper thick in the air, bleach underneath, wet wool from rain-soaked uniforms. It bent together into something she knew far too well. Her stomach clenched. Her hands went still. She looked at the man on the gurney. Scars mapped his chest, pale lines over old burns, the kind of roadmap that didn't come from bar fights or car accidents. These were the marks of someone who had been too close to things that exploded, too many times, in places that didn't exist on tourist maps. Then she saw the tattoo. High on his left chest, half hidden under an ECG lead. Small, black ink, a viper coiled around a dagger. Grace stopped breathing. She knew that tattoo. She knew it because she had one just like it, hidden on the inside of her left forearm, always covered by her long scrub sleeves. She had gotten it in a tent that smelled like diesel and antiseptic, surrounded by men who laughed too loud because they were afraid of the silence. "Get out of the way, Holloway. Dalton." Lang's bark snapped her back. He was glaring at her over the gurney, hands already in blue gloves. His eyes dropped to her badge, to the red sticker, then back to her face. "This is not a first-week case," he said. "Go help with sutures or something." "Yes, doctor," she said. Her voice came out steady. It always did. She stepped back, but she didn't leave the doorway. Ethan Mercer's blood pressure dropped to 70/40, then 60/38. The monitor screamed. Nurses called out numbers that sounded like a countdown. "Prep him for surgery," Lang ordered. "Get consent from whoever has authority. I am not losing this case." Then Ethan's eyes opened. Not gently, not gradually. They snapped open, wide, bright, and completely empty of recognition. His pupils were blown. His gaze swept the room without landing on anything, like he was tracking something only he could see. "Sir, you're in a hospital," Lang said loud and clear. "You are safe. Stay still and let us work." The words bounced off whatever wall Ethan had built inside his head. His hand curled into the sheet. The tendons in his wrist went sharp as wire. Muscles jumped along his neck. His breathing hitched, fast, shallow, the breathing of a man who was not in this room. "Easy, Captain," the respiratory tech said, reaching to adjust the mask. "Just breathe. In and out. You're good." Ethan's hands shot up faster than anyone expected. He knocked the mask away. Plastic cracked against the rail. Monitor cables snapped off his chest one by one. Small pops like firecrackers. The oxygen tubing whipped sideways. "Do not touch me." The sound was raw, scraped out from behind clenched teeth. "Grab his shoulders," someone said. Two nurses moved in. They reached for him, hands open. Ethan reacted like they'd swung weapons. His arms shot out. One nurse stumbled backward into a rolling stool. The stool skidded and crashed into the supply cart. The other nurse jerked her hands back. The IV line tore loose, blood streaking across white sheets. "Security!" Lang shouted. "Now!" The doors slammed open. Two officers rushed in, belts heavy with radios and plastic restraints. One of them, a big man named Darius, still held a half-eaten granola bar in his left hand. "Is this guy armed?" Darius asked. "Just dangerous," Lang snapped. "Get him pinned before he hurts someone." But Ethan wasn't confused. Grace could see it from the doorway. She could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, the way his gaze skimmed over the white coats, the masks, the cameras in the corners. He wasn't looking for help. He was scanning for exits. He was taking inventory. The officers closed in, hands open, palms out, like that would soften what was coming. Someone at the head of the bed reached for a restraint strap. Ethan moved. He bucked hard. The gurney shuddered. One officer grabbed his forearm and got thrown off balance. The other tried to catch his wrist and almost caught his elbow instead. The curtain hooks rattled. Metal instruments hit the floor, scalpels and clamps spinning under shoes. "Stop resisting," Darius barked. Ethan snarled something through his teeth that didn't sound like English. It had the clipped rhythm of a radio transmission, syllables crushed close together, code meant to be heard over static and gunfire. "Hold him," Lang shouted. A resident reached for Ethan's leg. He might as well have grabbed a live wire. Ethan's knee slammed into the rail. The whole gurney slid across the floor. The heart monitor lost contact. The blood pressure machine beeped in error. Grace watched his face. His eyes had gone flat, focused on something past the ceiling, past the building, past the city. He wasn't seeing fluorescent lights and white tile. She recognized that look. She had seen it in tents and hallways and the backs of helicopters. It belonged to people who had the wrong sky in their heads. "Get a sedative in him," Lang ordered. "I can't get close enough," the nurse with the syringe called. Darius dropped the granola bar into his pocket and lunged for Ethan's shoulder. Ethan twisted, broke the grip, and his hand came up toward the officer's face. Grace moved. She didn't think about it. She didn't weigh the risks. She stepped fully into the bay, past the rolling stool, past the wrecked instrument tray, past every voice that shouted her name. She stopped at the head of the bed. "Grace, get back," Lang said sharply. "You are not cleared for this." She didn't answer him. Ethan's arm drew back again. Muscles bunched. knuckles white. His eyes snapped toward the brightest light above the bed, as if it were a flare going off. His breath came in harsh, shallow pulls. Grace set her hand flat on the rail, close enough to feel the heat coming off his skin, far enough to pull back if he swung. "Captain Mercer," she said, low, steady. "Ethan." He didn't turn. His gaze whipped toward the curtain, then toward the officers. "Don't touch me," he snarled. Darius reached for his wrist again. Grace didn't raise her voice. She aimed it, the way she used to aim a flashlight in a blacked-out corridor, precise and deliberate. "Ethan!" His eyes flicked toward her. Not focus, only motion. But enough. She bent closer, so close that the only place for her words to land was his ear. "Viper 3, she murmured. "Echo, fall." 6 syllables, smooth and quiet. They fell into the air like a pattern she hadn't spoken in years. They tasted of sand and metal in her mouth. They didn't belong in a clean white room, but here they were, sliding out of her anyway. Everything stopped. Ethan froze. His next breath halted halfway in his chest. His fingers loosened, grip slackening on the sheet. His eyes, still wide, snapped away from the light and locked onto her face. The officers hung there mid-reach. Lang's mouth stayed open around the start of another order. The only thing moving was the heartbeat line on the monitor. Ethan blinked. Slow, like a shutter dragging open. "Say it again," he rasped. Grace swallowed. Her tongue felt dry and thick. She lined the words up in her head before she could push them out a second time. "Viper 3, she repeated. "Echo fall." His throat worked. The cords in his neck eased. He stared at her like he was trying to make 2 images overlap. The nurse in blue scrubs and someone else. Someone from before. Then his gaze dropped. Her sleeve had ridden up in the chaos. Just 2 inches. But it was enough. There it was, on the inside of her left forearm. Black ink, slightly faded. A viper coiled around a dagger. The same tattoo on his chest. Ethan's eyes went wide. Not with fear this time, with something that looked like it might shatter him. "Doc Dalton," he whispered. Barely a sound, a breath more than a word. Nobody in this hospital had ever called her that. The nearest resident blinked. Did he just say doctor? Lang shot him a look sharp enough to cut, then turned it on Grace. "What did you just say to him?" he demanded. "What code was that?" Grace didn't look away from Ethan to answer. "Grab a new IV line," she said calmly, "and another set of leads. Connect him again, gently this time. He's not going to swing at you if you stop treating him like a threat." Darius hesitated. "You sure about that, ma'am?" Ethan's hand lay open on the sheet, fingers still. The tendons had gone from wire-tight to merely taut. His shoulders sagged into the mattress. He was still breathing fast, but the breaths were less like gasps and more like steady pulls. He was watching Grace as if the rest of the room had gone out of focus. "I'm sure," she said. The certainty in her voice did the work. Slowly, Darius let go of Ethan's forearm. The other officer released the opposite wrist. No new punches, no new kicks. The room began to breathe again. A nurse stepped forward with fresh ECG leads, hands trembling. Grace shifted her position, placing herself exactly where Ethan had to look through her to see the nurse approaching. "Eyes on me," she told him. He obeyed. The leads went on. The monitor caught the rhythm. Not pretty, not regular, but there. "No mask," Grace said. "Nasal cannula first. Give him air without covering his face." Lang stared at her. "This is my trauma bay, Nurse Dalton," he snapped. "You don't come in here and start giving orders based on some mystery phrase and a hunch." Grace finally looked at him. "Then order it yourself," she said. "You want him calm. Don't strap plastic over half his face right after he ripped it off." Lang opened his mouth, closed it again. His eyes flicked back to Ethan. The respiratory tech was already switching the equipment. Soft prongs slid under Ethan's nose. Tubing looped over his ears instead of across his mouth. The numbers on the monitor climbed. Ethan swallowed. His gaze had cleared enough that Grace could see the struggle to stay present, the way each second cost him effort. "Is it really you?" he asked. No rank, no protocol, just the raw, disbelieving edge of a man who had already buried the person standing in front of him. Grace felt her mouth go dry. "It's me," she said. Her voice didn't shake. That surprised her more than anything Ethan had done. He closed his eyes for one long breath. When he opened them, the words came out rough. "You pulled us off that roof," he said. "East of the river, night mission. They said you never made it to the convoy." Grace's fingers tightened on the rail. Metal bit into her palm. "We're not talking about that," she said. The line of his mouth twitched. He accepted it, the way soldiers accepted bad weather. Not happily, not fully, but with the understanding that arguing wouldn't change the forecast. Across the bed, Lang stood with his arms crossed. His expression had shifted from anger to something more complicated. A man realizing he was standing next to a locked door and someone else held the key. "Well, Doc Dalton," he said at last, the title edged with disbelief. "Since your magic words seem to have bought us a cooperative patient, perhaps you'd like to explain how you know classified-sounding call signs in my emergency department." Grace kept her eyes on Ethan one moment longer. He watched her back, a faint spark buried under pain and exhaustion. Something that might have been humor once. She let go of the rail and straightened. "I know how to read a wound," she said. "Start with that, Dr. Lang. Then we can talk about the rest." No one moved. The fluorescent lights hummed. The monitor clicked and chirped. Somewhere down the hall, a gurney squeaked, distant, thin, ordinary. And Grace Dalton stood in the middle of a trauma bay in Houston, Texas, with sand in her memory and a dead man's heartbeat under her hand, feeling the weight of a life she had buried 3 years ago rise up through the floor and settle back into her bones. Lang cleared his throat like a man swallowing something he didn't want to taste. He looked at Grace one more time, then turned to the nurse nearest Ethan's shoulder. "Peel it back," he said. "Let me see the wound." The nurse swallowed hard. Her gloves were already streaked red. She reached for the soaked dressing and lifted one corner, peeling the gauze away with the kind of care people use when they know what's underneath won't be kind. Blood oozed up dark and lazy. The gauze tore free with a wet, soft sound that made 2 residents look away. Grace stepped closer. The entry wound sat high near the front of Ethan's right shoulder, ragged at the edges, burned in a speckled, uneven radius. Not a neat circle, not a clean hole. The staining spread farther than it should have for a single straight track. She leaned in. Small, dark specks dotted the surrounding tissue, different sizes, different depths, some barely breaking the surface. Others buried so deep they wouldn't come out without a fight. Her fingers itched for forceps and a headlamp. Old muscle memory woke up inside her like something that had only been pretending to sleep. "That's not just a gunshot," she said. Lang snorted. "Everyone heard the medics say blast involvement. This isn't news." "Look at the pattern," Grace said, and her voice carried something that made Jamie Park stop writing on his glove. "Entries too shallow for the tissue damage. Exits too narrow for a full round. Secondary abrasions around both. Burn spread isn't uniform." She traced the perimeter in the air without touching skin. This was fragmentation, concussive. Something exploded and sent metal in at an angle. He didn't just get shot, Dr. Lang. He got caught in the edge of something that wanted to take the whole room apart. Jamie leaned in, curiosity overriding rank. He squinted at the specks embedded in the tissue. "So those are fragments," Grace said. "Casing, walls, whatever stood between him and the blast center." Lang's posture changed. Half an inch of stiffness left his shoulders, and that half inch told Grace everything. He was listening now. He didn't want to be, but he was. "Fine," he said. "He was near the wrong end of an explosion. That still doesn't explain why he came in labeled as a gunshot." "Because people say gunshot when they see blood in a hole," Grace replied. It reads better in a chart than something went very wrong. Jamie lifted his eyes to her. You saw this kind of thing a lot? He asked. The room listened. Grace could feel it. Every ear turned her way, even the ones pretending not to. I saw enough, she said. Ethan shifted at the sound of her voice. His eyes had drifted half closed, exhaustion creeping in now that his body had stopped trying to throw itself off the bed. He looked down at his own shoulder, then back up at her. Doorway, he murmured. 2 floors up, charge went off lower than it was supposed to. Grace's jaw tightened. The image came back sharp and unwelcome. A blown-out door frame sagging inward. Dust thick as fog. The taste of chalk and iron. A pressure wave rolling up a stairwell and hitting her chest like a fist. She pushed it down. She'd gotten good at that. 3 years of practice. Tilt him, she said, her voice flattening back to clinical. I want to see how far the path extends. Lang hesitated. Then he gestured to the team. On 3. 1, 2, 3. They rolled Ethan just enough to open the view of his back and side. He grunted through clenched teeth but didn't fight. Grace saw the full channel of damage and her stomach dropped. The angle didn't line up with a shot from straight ahead. It curved downward, as if the force had come from his right and below, catching him while he was turned. Exactly the way you'd stand if you were covering a stairwell and someone shoved you sideways out of the main line of fire. I've seen this pattern, she heard herself say. Lang raised an eyebrow. In your extensive 6 weeks of civilian nursing? In my years as a corpsman, she answered. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nobody moved. Jamie's pen stopped. The nurse holding gauze froze. Even Darius, lingering near the curtain, went still. Lang folded his arms slowly, the way a man does when the ground under him shifts, and he's deciding whether to stand firm or step back. A corpsman, Lang repeated. Hospital corpsman, 2nd class, Grace said. Fleet Marine Force, attached to a Marine recon unit. Where? Lang asked. She looked back at the wound, at the burns and specks and torn flesh forming a pattern she wished she didn't recognize. There had been a building, thick white walls, cracks running like veins, a charge hidden in rubble that should have been inert. The first blast took the corner off the roof. The second turned a stairwell into a shotgun. She knew better than to say the region or the town or the unit designation out loud. Those things came attached to alarms she had no desire to trigger. But the name formed in her mind anyway. Operation Iron Veil. She didn't realize she'd whispered it until Ethan responded. His fingers flexed on the sheet. The lines around his mouth deepened. Yeah, he said, voice barely holding together. That one. Jamie frowned. Iron Veil? Is that some kind of op code? Lang shot him a warning look. None of your concern. Then he turned back to Grace. And not ours either, unless it affects whether this man keeps his arm and his life. It affects everything, Ethan muttered. 9/12. Grace breathed in slow through her nose. Shrapnel like this migrates, she said, forcing her tone back to textbook steady. You miss even a few pieces and he bleeds later in places you're not looking. Or they heat up in imaging. You need to know what kind of metal you're dealing with. Which we can determine with proper scans, Lang said, not by staring at it and chanting poetry. The pattern tells you where to look, Grace shot back, how deep to expect it, where the overpressure might have done internal damage without obvious external signs. Lang held her gaze. Beneath the armor of arrogance, something shifted. Calculation. The slow recognition that information he did not have was standing in front of him in blue scrubs and a red sticker. You're suggesting what? He asked. That we tailor our scans to match some classified playbook in your head? I'm suggesting you don't treat this like a clean gunshot on a firing range, she said. He was in tight quarters when it hit. That means echo in his chest, potential lung involvement, maybe microfractures. You look for the echoes, not just the holes. The words came easily now. Too easily. She could almost feel sand under her knees again, feel the thud of distant artillery through her palms, pressed against someone else's skin. Her body remembered how to talk people through staying alive. It had never really forgotten. Jamie scribbled on the back of his other glove, eyes wide. Lang took a breath as if preparing to argue, held it, and let it out in a short, irritated sigh. "Fine," he said. "We'll run an extended series on the chest and shoulder, and we'll note possible concussive trauma." He paused. "Satisfied?" "This isn't about my satisfaction," Grace said. "He'll thank you for it when he can lift that arm again." Ethan's mouth twitched. "You're assuming I'm keeping the arm," he murmured. Grace looked at him, at the strain etched around his eyes, at the way his fingers hovered near the rail and then stopped, as if reaching for something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. "I'm planning for it," she said. "You can handle the rest." That earned a tired huff that might have once been a laugh. A long time ago, in a different country. Lang cleared his throat. "Get him to imaging as soon as he's stable enough to move. Prep OR2 just in case. And someone find out if he has family on record." The staff moved with new purpose. The nurse wrapped the wound. Jamie went to input orders. The security officers slipped out through the curtain folds. For a moment, the bay felt oddly spacious, like a room after a storm when the pressure drops and the air changes. Ethan watched people leave, then brought his gaze back to Grace. Without all the bodies crowding the bed, the distance between them felt deliberate, chosen. "You read that wound like a map," he said quietly. "You're bleeding on my floor," she replied. "I'm motivated." He kept looking at her, a question sitting behind his eyes that he wasn't sure how to ask. "You weren't a doctor when I knew you," he said. "They called you something else." "Corsman," she said, "or Doc, depending on how bad things were." "They were always bad," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "they were." He nodded, lids lowering. "They told us no corpsman made it out," he murmured. "Said the medic went down with the rest when the roof fell." Grace felt something twist tight in her chest, a knot she'd learned never to pull. "They were misinformed," she said. "Yeah," Ethan said, his gaze sharpening through the fog. "I'm starting to see that." The transport team arrived. "Imaging's ready for trauma too," someone called. Jamie jumped, then nodded. "Right, we should move him." He looked at Grace like he was asking permission he didn't need. She stepped back. "Go ahead," she said. "Keep that arm as still as you can." They unlocked the wheels. The gurney rolled. The motion jostled Ethan's shoulder, and pain creased his forehead in a sharp line, but he didn't look away from Grace. Not for a second. "You disappeared," he said quietly as they pushed him toward the door. She stood inside the curtain, hands at her sides. "So did you," she replied. His eyes held hers until the gurney turned the corner, and then he was gone. Pushed down the hall toward radiology, the sound of his monitor fading with each foot of linoleum. Grace stared at the space where he'd been. The sheet was still bunched where his fist had gripped it. A small bloodstain marked the spot where the IV had torn loose. The air smelled like copper and adrenaline and something older. The ghost of a memory she'd locked in a box under her bed 3 years ago. "Holloway, Dalton." She turned. Jamie Park lingered at the edge of the bay. Up close, without the chaos, he looked younger than his white coat tried to make him. His surgical cap was off, his hair flat where the elastic had pressed. "I'm Jamie," he said. "Dr. Park. I probably should have introduced myself an hour ago." "Nice to meet you, Dr. Park," she said. He shifted his weight. "You really served," he said. "In that operation, Iron Veil." Her shoulders stiffened. "Is that going to change how you read my chart?" He shook his head quickly. "No, I mean, maybe in a good way. I didn't know I was standing next to someone who could read a blast wound like a book." He flushed. "I'm not saying you didn't look like you could, nobody told us." "Nobody was supposed to," she said. He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "I'm glad somebody did. Tell us, I mean, before we shocked his heart into oblivion. She almost smiled. Almost. Go finish your notes, she said. He's going to need a competent surgical team. I'll try to fake competent, Jamie said. You can correct me when I'm not. He left, hurrying down the hall with his tablet pressed to his chest like a shield. Grace watched him go, then ducked out of the bay. She didn't head to the desk. She didn't go to the board. She walked to the supply closet at the end of the corridor and pulled the door shut behind her. Quiet. No monitors, no voices, just the smell of plastic and paper and the faint rubber scent of latex gloves. She leaned her back against the metal shelves and closed her eyes. For one moment, just one, she let the other room come back. The one with the cracked roof and the broken staircase. The one where Carter didn't reach the convoy. The one where Russ turned around and walked back into a hallway that was already collapsing and said 5 words she heard every single night. That's an order, Dalton. Move. She had moved. The building had folded in behind her with a sound like the earth swallowing itself whole. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. Steady. She flexed her fingers once, reached for a new box of gauze, pulled it off the shelf, tucked it under her arm, and stepped back into the corridor where the lights buzzed and the floor was clean and the board was full of names that didn't know a thing about Operation Iron Veil. She dropped the gauze in the supply bin and checked the board. Trauma 2 had a new line. Mercer, Ethan, Imaging. Next to it, in neat block letters, someone had written OR2 on standby. She pulled up his chart on the nearest computer. Blood work logged. Orders for CT, chest and shoulder. Notes from Lang and Park. Then a shadow fell across her screen. Excuse me. The voice was male, smooth. It carried something that didn't fit the noise of the emergency room. A practiced weight, the kind used in briefings and secure conference rooms and conversations where nothing was recorded, but everything was remembered. Grace turned. The man standing at the corner of the station didn't look like a patient or a family member. His suit was too well cut. His posture was too straight. Dark gray jacket, no tie, white shirt open at the collar. His shoes were polished despite the rain outside. An ID badge was clipped to his belt. The plastic caught the light, but the text was turned away. "Can I help you?" Marta asked from behind the desk, phone still pressed to her ear. "I'm looking for the attending on Captain Ethan Mercer," the man said, "and for a nurse named Dalton." Grace felt the back of her neck prickle, the way it used to before the second blast, before the floor gave way, before the sound changed. Marta covered the receiver and jerked her chin. "Dalton's right there." Lang's consult. The man's eyes found Grace and settled. They were hazel, cool, careful in a way that looked relaxed but wasn't. Every expression filtered before it reached the surface. "Miss Dalton?" he said. "Good. Saves me a step." He flipped his badge around with 2 fingers. Department of Defense, Federal Liaison, and beneath that a name, Cole Everett. Grace didn't flinch, but something inside her braced for impact the way it hadn't braced in 3 years. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Cole shook his head once. "Problem is a strong word," he said. "Let's call it an urgent point of interest." Marta listened to that, then to the tiny voice on the phone. She muttered something about calling back and hung up. "I didn't know the DOD sent people for regular trauma cases," she said. "We don't," Cole replied. "Captain Mercer is not a regular trauma case." His eyes hadn't left Grace. "You were in the room when he came in," he said. "You calmed him when security couldn't." "I was doing my job," Grace said. "Plenty of people in scrubs in this building," Cole answered. Only one of them said 6 very specific syllables. Marta looked between them with the expression of someone who had just realized the conversation had moved into a language she didn't speak. "I'll go check on the front desk," she announced, already backing away. "Make sure nobody stole the magazines." She left, not fast enough to look like fleeing, fast enough to leave the 2 of them alone. Cole watched her go, then turned back to Grace. "Walk with me," he said. It sounded like a suggestion, It wasn't. Grace glanced at the board, then at the hallway toward imaging. She weighed her options and found they all ended in the same place. Fine, she said. They walked. Cole moved at an easy pace, not strolling, not rushing. The kind of walk that assumed people would step aside, and they did, even if they didn't know why. Grace fell in beside him. Up close, she caught the details. Faint wear at the edges of his collar, a watch line under his cuff, eyes that flicked to every doorway and intersection as they passed. He was not just a suit. You know his rank, she said. You know mine. Hospital corpsman, second class, Cole said without hesitation. HM2, or Doc, apparently. The words scraped across her skin like a cold hand. Those records were sealed, she said. They were, he agreed. That seal loosened the minute you used an active call sign from a black file in a civilian emergency room. They reached a quiet stretch of hallway near an unused consult room. Cole stopped and turned to face her fully. You weren't supposed to use it, he said. Viper 3, Echo Fall. The code sounded different in his mouth, flat, stripped of memory. I wasn't supposed to need it, she replied. Something flickered across his expression. Not sympathy, recognition. What did you see when you walked into that bay? He asked. Because from where I read it, all anyone expected to see was a dangerous veteran and a lot of paperwork. Grace pictured Ethan, eyes glassed over, muscles coiled, hand flying toward the oxygen mask. A man whose body was still fighting a war his mind couldn't leave. I saw a man who didn't know which room he was in, she said, and I saw where the blast hit. Cole nodded slowly. Not many people can read both at once. He reached inside his jacket. Grace tensed. Reflex, not logic. But his hands came back out holding nothing but a plain, thick envelope. No markings, no return address. Only a name typed in clean black letters. HM2 Dalton, Grace M, Hospital Corpsman, second class. This is a hospital, she said. You could have sent an email. Some things do better on paper, he replied. There are still a few doors that only open with an actual signature. He held it out. She didn't take it. Why now? She asked. You had my records the whole time. We had a file on someone who didn't want to be found, Cole said. A medic flagged as presumed KIA in an operation that went sideways in every direction. Command made a call to Lockett. You helped that call stick by disappearing. His gaze held hers without blinking. Tonight, Captain Mercer comes in bleeding from a pattern that matches a classified tactical report from the same region, he continued. Then he wakes up trying to rip the room apart and stops cold when you call him by a name that was never supposed to leave that valley. He tilted the envelope slightly. That makes your file relevant again. Grace stared at her own name on the paper, her old name, her real name, the one she'd folded up and put away with the uniform and the bracelet and the photographs of people who didn't come home. I'm not in the Navy anymore, she said. I'm aware, Cole said. This envelope might not change that. It updates the context. She reached out and took it. The paper was heavier than it looked, cool against her fingers. She slid a thumb under the sealed flap. The glue gave with a muted tear. Inside, no memo, no briefing, just a single sheet folded twice. She unfolded it. 3 lines. The first, Operation Iron Veil, status review. Below that, a list of 2 names. 1, Mercer, Ethan R. Status, alive. 2, Dalton, Grace M. Status, reactivated. The rest of the page was blank. Grace read the word 3 times. Reactivated. It sat in her mouth like a pill she hadn't agreed to swallow. I didn't agree to this, she said. You agreed to keep breathing, Cole replied. That put you back on the board the second Iron Veil shifted from theoretical history to active concern. You buried that file, she said. We sealed it, he corrected. Different verb. Her fingers tightened on the paper until the edges bent. "What does reactivated mean?" she asked. "On paper," Cole said, "it means your clearance status is under internal review, and your name just moved from the far right column of a very old list into one we actually look at." "And off paper?" He considered her for a moment, then quietly, "Off paper, it means the people who walked away from that building are still anchors when the ground starts to shift, and we pay attention to our anchors." Grace folded the paper along its original creases. Each fold felt like a decision she hadn't been asked to make. "He thinks I died," she said. "And until tonight," Cole replied, "as far as his side of the paperwork knew, he was right." Grace slid the page back into the envelope and pressed it against her chest. Her heart beat against the paper like it was trying to read what was inside through bone and skin. "Does he know?" she asked. "About the status change?" "Not yet. About me being alive?" "I spoke with him briefly before imaging," Cole said. "He's aware the department is paying attention." "Did you ask him permission to drag me into this?" "No," Cole said. "I didn't need his permission to follow a code phrase to its source." He watched her fingers dig into the envelope. Then he added, more quietly, "I did ask him one question. I asked if the person who used that phrase tonight was the same one who kept his team alive on a very ugly night." He paused. "He said yes, without hesitation." Grace let out a breath she didn't know she'd been caging inside her ribs. The hallway seemed to tilt for 1 second, just slightly, as if the whole building had shifted on its foundation and decided to settle somewhere new. "You came here to tell me my name moved on a list," she said. "Is that all?" "For now," Cole said. "This is an emergency department, and you're on shift. I'm not here to pull you into a van." The way he said it almost made her laugh. Almost. His gaze flicked past her shoulder toward the trauma bays. "I needed you to see that paper," he said, "to understand that people above my pay grade are aware you exist, and they're adjusting their maps accordingly." "Maps," she repeated, "the kind with circles and lines and names written in margins," he said. "You've drawn some yourself." That took her back. Knights hunched over crude sketches in dirt and on walls, marking choke points and blast radii and safe routes through buildings that wouldn't be standing by morning. "I work here now," she said. "I draw blood and hang fluids and tell people where the bathrooms are." "You also talked a collapsing soldier out of a flashback with 6 words," Cole said, "and diagnosed blast pattern injuries before the scans ran." He stepped back a pace, giving her air. "You're more than a one-line item, Ms. Dalton." He turned to leave, then stopped. "And Miss Dalton," he said over his shoulder, "don't throw that envelope away. Reactivated isn't the sort of status that disappears because you pretend not to see it." Then he walked away, calm, unhurried, blending into the flow of the hospital corridor until he was just another dark jacket moving among scrubs and white coats. Grace stood alone, the envelope solid against her palm, the corners digging into skin. She slid it into her scrub pocket and pressed the fabric flat until the shape disappeared. The hospital noise washed back in. A call light chimed. Wheels squeaked. A phone rang, stopped, rang again. Then the overhead speaker crackled, and every muscle in Grace Dalton's body turned to wire. "Code Blue, CT Suite. Code Blue, CT Suite. Patient Mercer, Ethan." Grace's feet hit the floor before her brain caught up. She moved through the corridor fast enough that the air tugged at her scrub top, weaving between a respiratory tech dragging equipment and 2 residents cutting across from the opposite hall. She didn't run. Running caused panic, but every step she took ate ground like she was being chased by something she couldn't afford to let catch her. The CT suite door was already open. The sound hit first. The monitor sharp and frantic, voices piled on top of each other with no rhythm, no coordination. The scanner bed was frozen halfway out, stuck between function and failure. She stepped inside. Ethan lay on the CT table. The sheet was twisted under him. The nasal cannula she had fought for was gone. replaced by a full mask strapped tight over his nose and mouth. His chest heaved against it. His skin had shifted from gray to a patchy, alarming blue that crept from his lips down his neck like something was stealing the color straight out of his body. And the right side of his chest was wrong. It rose differently than the left, slower, stiffer, like something invisible was pressing down on it from the inside. Lang stood at the head of the bed in fresh gloves. His jaw was locked. He started desatting halfway through the scan, one of the CT techs said, voice cracking. We tried to pull him out, but he just dropped. Heart rate 160 and irregular, a resident called. He's going into arrhythmia. Get the crash cart, Lang snapped. Charge to 200. We are not losing him in a scanner. The nurse shoved the red cart forward. The defibrillator woke up with a thin rising whine that climbed through the room like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. Grace edged around a tech and came to the side of the table. Ethan's eyes rolled under half-closed lids. His breaths came in ragged gasps, short, shallow, the sound of a man trying to suck air through a collapsing tunnel. Move back, Dalton, Lang barked. You don't have clearance for this. She didn't move. She looked at Ethan's neck. The veins stood out thick and roped, pulsing against his skin like cables about to snap. She looked at his chest, left side rising and falling, right side barely shifting. She pressed 2 fingers against his collarbone and felt the muscles pulling with each breath. Too much effort for too little air. The monitor didn't sound like a heart that had decided to quit. It sounded like a heart that was being crushed inside a space that was getting smaller with every second. 200 joules, the nurse at the cart reported. Charged. Lang grabbed the paddles. Clear, he said. You do that, Grace said, and you'll fry a heart that's trying to work. The words hit the room like a slap. Every head turned. Lang froze, paddles in his hands, knuckles white. This is not the moment, he snapped. He's in a malignant rhythm. He's in trouble because he can't breathe, Grace said. Not because his heart forgot how. She pointed with her chin. Look at his neck. Look at his right chest. Listen, if you've got the nerve. The younger resident grabbed a stethoscope. He pressed it to the left side of Ethan's chest. Listened, then moved to the right. His face changed. Left side, rough breath sounds, but present. Right side, nothing. Hollow silence, like pressing your ear to a wall and hearing an empty room where a life should be. Decreased breath sounds on the right, the resident said. His voice broke halfway through. Neck veins are distended, another added. BP 60/30, heart rate still climbing. Grace could feel the shape of it, the trapped air inside Ethan's chest, pushing his lung down, shoving his heart sideways, squeezing it into a corner where it had no room to beat. Every second the pressure built was a second his heart worked harder against a wall it couldn't punch through. Tension pneumothorax, she said. Right-sided. His heart isn't the primary problem. It's collateral damage. Lang tightened his grip on the paddles. And what would you suggest we do while his rhythm falls apart? Talk it down? Relieve the pressure, Grace said, or you can shock him all night and it won't fix the fact that his lung is choking his heart. This isn't a field hospital, Lang shot back. We don't stab people in scanners and hope for the best. We follow protocol. Grace stepped closer to the table. Her eyes locked on the landmarks she needed. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. The place her hands had gone without thinking more times than she could count, in a life she'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. We follow physiology, she said. You decompress that chest, you give his heart room, and his rhythm has a chance. You shock him now, you cook what's left while the house is still on fire. Lang clenched his jaw so hard the muscles jumped. Nurse, he said to the woman at the cart, hand me the paddles. The nurse hesitated. Her hands hovered between the paddles and the cart, caught between 2 currents pulling in opposite directions. She looked at Lang. She looked at Grace. The defibrillator whined. Then the door burst open. Jamie Park came through it, breathing hard, surgical cap in his hand, eyes wide. "I heard the page," he said. "What's happening?" "Right-sided tension," Grace said before anyone else could speak. "Secondary to blast. He's drowning, not dying." Jamie looked at the monitor, then at Ethan's chest, then at the paddles still in Lang's hands. Something passed through his face, a decision forming in real time, the way cracks form in ice just before it gives way. "Are we sure?" he asked. "Look at him," Grace said. He did. He looked at the distended neck veins. He looked at the right chest that barely moved, while the left still tried to do the work of two. He looked at the monitor screaming a rhythm that everyone in the room was interpreting wrong. A rhythm that wasn't a dying heart, but a heart being strangled. Jamie turned to the crash cart and yanked open a drawer. His fingers moved fast through sealed packages until he found what he wanted. An 18-gauge needle, long, in its sterile wrapper. He ripped the package open and slapped the syringe into Grace's waiting hand. "Here," he said. Lang stared at him. "What do you think you're doing?" "Not killing him by accident," Jamie said. His voice was tighter than usual, pitched higher than he probably wanted, but he didn't look away from Lang. He held the stare the way a man holds a rope over a cliff, shaking, terrified, but committed. Lang's face went red. "I am the attending surgeon in this room, and she's the one who knows what's inside his chest," Jamie said. The air turned thin. Grace didn't wait for permission, that was never coming. She snapped the cap off the needle and handed it to the nurse. She swabbed the target spot with an alcohol pad. Cold air kissed the wet skin. Ethan's breath rasped against the mask like sandpaper on wood. She pressed her fingers along his ribs, counting silently. Second space, mid-clavicular, a spot she could find in a blackout, in a sandstorm, in a building that was coming apart around her ears. "On 3, she said to Ethan, though she wasn't sure how much of her reached through. 1, she drew back the syringe. 2, she felt the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her hand. 3, she drove the needle in. Resistance at first, the rubbery give of skin and tissue, the body's instinct to keep things out. Then a sudden softness as the needle slipped into the pleural space, past the wall of trapped air that had been killing him by inches. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. The room held its breath. The monitor screamed. Lang's hands stayed frozen on the paddles. Jamie's eyes went wide enough to show white all the way around. Then there was a hiss. Not loud, but it carried. A thin rush of air escaping through metal, the sound of pressure bleeding away. Trapped air releasing its grip on the lung, on the heart, on the space that had been shrinking with every one of Ethan's desperate breaths. The monitor stuttered, then steadied. The jagged lines softened by a fraction. The number on the oxygen saturation display climbed. 2 points, then 3. The neck veins eased, flattening against his skin. Ethan's next breath dragged in deeper, less strangled, less like a man fighting to pull air through concrete. Jamie let out the breath he'd been holding so hard his hands were shaking. "Vitals are creeping back," he said. "Heart rate's still high, but the rhythm is less chaotic." The nurse at the cart slowly, carefully, lowered the paddles back into their cradle. The defibrillator's whine held for a moment, then began to drop as the charge bled off. The sound died like a threat withdrawing. Lang watched the numbers. He watched them the way a man watches a jury returning to the courtroom, wanting to believe, refusing to hope, terrified of being wrong. The oxygen climbed another point. The blood pressure inched up. The heart rate dropped from 160 to 140, then to 130. Ethan's eyes fluttered, then opened wider than they had since he'd arrived in the scanner. The glassy edge was gone. There was presence in his gaze now, damaged, exhausted, but human. He turned his head just enough to see Grace standing at his side, one hand still steady on the needle. "Tuesday," he rasped. Grace leaned closer. "What?" He swallowed. His throat worked like every word cost him something he'd never get back. We used to call that a Tuesday, he said, back then. Grace felt something catch in her chest. A laugh, a sob, something in between that she couldn't name and didn't trust. Here we call it saving your life, she said. Lang set the paddles down on the cart. The sound was gentle, almost careful. He cleared his throat. What procedure did you just perform? He asked. For the record. Needle decompression, Grace said. Hemodynamic salvage, if you want the fancy term. You can chart it however makes the lawyers breathe easier. One of the CT techs let out a shaky chuckle that cracked the frozen tension like a rock through thin ice. Someone exhaled. Someone else shifted their weight, and it was suddenly the loudest sound in the room. Lang looked from Ethan to the syringe, then to the monitor. The numbers were climbing, not fast, not pretty, but climbing. We still need to get him to the OR, he said. His voice was softer now by a single notch. The kind of shift that most people wouldn't notice, but Grace heard like a door unlocking. But he's not coding on a table in my scanner. That's something. Grace handed the syringe off to the nurse and stepped back half a pace. Pressure's up to 80/48, Jamie reported, checking the monitor again. Oxygen climbing. He's not pretty, but he's holding. All right, Lang said. Move him carefully this time. No more mask over his mouth unless absolutely necessary. He met Grace's eyes for 1 second. One brief, reluctant second that cost him more than the words he said next. Good call. Grace inclined her head. It's his lung you should thank, she said. It wanted some personal space. They transferred Ethan back to a gurney. The motion was smoother now. Every hand on him moved with more care, more awareness. The careful touch of people who had just watched someone come within 30 seconds of a different ending. As they lifted him, Ethan's fingers brushed against Grace's wrist. Not a grip, not a grab, just contact. Warm skin against warm skin for the space of a heartbeat. His eyes had drifted half-closed again. Exhaustion was pulling him under. But the line of connection was still there. A thread stretched between them that had survived oxygen masks and code blues and a needle driven between ribs. Stay, he breathed. The word barely shaped itself. A whisper wearing the clothes of a command. I'm not going far, she said. They settled him on the gurney and began to roll. Grace walked alongside for a few steps, her hand trailing the rail the way you trail your fingers along a wall in the dark. Not for guidance, but for proof that something solid exists. Then she peeled off near the doorway as the surgical team converged. The double doors to the OR opened, swallowed the gurney, and closed again. The monitor sound muffled behind solid glass. Gone. Grace stood alone in the CT suite. The machine was still. The room smelled of ozone and antiseptic, and the faint copper echo of blood that had been there and left its signature behind. Jamie stayed behind too. He stood with his hands resting on the crash cart handle, looking at Grace with an expression she'd seen on young soldiers after their first firefight. Wide-eyed, stunned, recalibrating everything they thought they knew. You did that like you've done it 100 times, he said. I have, she answered. He let that settle. It took a moment. Then he spoke again, quieter. I almost shocked him, he said. I followed Lang's lead and I almost cooked a heart that wasn't the main problem. I didn't even think to look at his chest first. You thought of it when you listened, she said. Next time you'll think of it sooner. Next time, Jamie said, I'm calling you first. You better not wait that long, she replied. They rolled the crash cart back against the wall. The CT tech began resetting the room, wiping the table, coiling cables, unsilencing alarms. The ordinary machinery of a hospital putting itself back together after it had almost lost. Grace touched her scrub pocket. The envelope was still there. She felt the outline of it through the fabric. The folded paper with 2 names and 2 statuses, and a word that had chased her from a quiet hallway into a CT suite and guided her hand to the exact right spot between a dying man's ribs. Reactivated. It didn't feel like a word on paper anymore. It felt like a fact, like a scar that had never fully healed, only hidden itself under long sleeves, in clean scrubs, and a red sticker that said, "New staff." She turned toward the hallway. The OR had Ethan now. There would be updates, surgical notes, post-op vitals, new rhythms to listen to and worry about, and measure against the sound she just heard through a needle. The thin hiss of air releasing. The sound of a man's chest making room for his heart to beat again. She walked back into the corridor. Her legs were steady, her hands were still. But underneath the calm, in the place where she kept the things she didn't let anyone see, something had shifted. The box she'd sealed 3 years ago had cracked open, and what was inside wasn't darkness. It was skill. It was instinct. It was the part of her that had crawled across rubble and held arteries shut with bare fingers and screamed orders over the sound of a building dying. She'd spent 3 years calling that part of her a ghost. Tonight, it had saved a man's life. The ER swallowed her back into its rhythm. She checked the board. New names, new complaints, the ordinary river of small emergencies that never stopped flowing. She folded herself into the work and let her hands do what they knew. Blood pressures, medications, a chart that refused to print. But every time she passed the board, her eyes went to the same line. Mercer, Ethan, or 2. The status sat there unchanged. Pre-op became in procedure. In procedure stayed for a long time. The clock on the wall crept past 10, past 11, past midnight. The storm outside let go the windows. The rain stopped. The darkness stayed. Marta pressed a paper cup of coffee into Grace's hand at some point. It cooled before Grace remembered to drink it. The bitter taste still cut through the fog when she finally did. Between patients, she looked down the hall toward the elevators that led to the intensive care unit. It felt like looking at a different country through a window she wasn't sure she had the right to open. Then, when the board showed no fires waiting for her name, and the hallway had settled into a manageable hum, she heard the voice she'd been listening for without admitting it. "Dalton." She turned. Jamie stood there, surgical cap in his hand, hair flattened in odd lines from the elastic. His scrubs bore faint, dried smears that had once been red and were now the brown of something that had happened hours ago. His eyes were tired, but underneath the fatigue there was light. The kind of light that only comes from watching something terrible almost happen, and then not. "He's out," Jamie said. "Surgery went as well as it could. They stabilized the artery, pulled what they could of the fragments. The arm is still attached." Some of the tightness in Grace's chest loosened. Not all of it, but enough to take a full breath for the first time in hours. "How's his heart?" she asked. "Holding a grudge," Jamie said. "But better. Rhythm's ugly, not catastrophic. They're watching him upstairs." She nodded. "Good." Jamie shifted his cap from one hand to the other. "You can go see him, you know," he said. "You're listed in the notes as the reason he made it to the OR without coding. I don't think anyone's going to kick you out for standing in a doorway for 5 minutes." "I'm on shift," Grace said. "So am I," Jamie replied. "We just changed the view. There are enough bodies on the floor to cover you. Marta said to tell you that if you don't go, she'll find an excuse to send you up anyway." Grace almost smiled at that. The idea of Marta conspiring with the hospital's newest resident was exactly the kind of quiet rebellion that held emergency departments together. "She forgets who trained whom," Grace said. "I think she remembers," Jamie said. "She also remembers what happens when people try to muscle through things alone." He let that sit for a second. "Go, before Lang comes out of his post-op glow and finds more charts for you to sign." She gave in, not because she wanted to admit how badly she needed to see Ethan breathing on his own, but because denying it had started to take more energy than she had left. The elevator ride was short. The doors opened on the 3rd floor, and everything changed. Softer lights, cooler air, measured sounds. The surgical ICU stretched out in a long, quiet line. Large windows at one end showing Houston scattered with lights, a city that had no idea what had happened in one of its hospitals tonight. She checked the room list. SICU 7. She walked there slowly, each step pressing the rubber floor against her soles. The door was half open. Monitor glow spilled into the hallway, painting a faint green line on the opposite wall like a road leading in. She knocked once on the frame with her knuckles. The nurse inside looked up. Dark blue scrubs, hair tied back, badge reading Lucy, RN. "You're Dalton," Lucy said, not a question. "Word moves fast," Grace said. "Lang was very specific," Lucy replied. "If a quiet one named Grace shows up, let her in." The faintest trace of a smile. 5 minutes, he's sedated, but his body is still deciding how mad it is at us. Grace stepped into the room. Ethan looked smaller under the blankets. The bulk that had seemed so dangerous in the ER was hidden under layers of white and tubing. His shoulder was wrapped in clean bandage. A line of sutures peeked out along his upper chest. The nasal cannula delivered oxygen in a soft, steady hiss. His chest rose and fell, slower, more even. The monitor showed bumps and dips, but no wild spikes. His face, without pain contorting it, had softer lines. The scar at his hairline stood out pale and sharp. The viper tattoo on his chest was half covered by bandage, but she could see the tail of it curling out from under white gauze. She stopped at the side of the bed. "He's been muttering," Lucy said from the other side, adjusting drip rates. "Names, mostly. A few words I didn't catch." "Was he agitated?" Grace asked. "A little, but when I told him you were okay, he settled." Grace looked at her. "You told him?" Lucy shrugged. "Trauma nurse gossip. Also, one of the residents was very bad at whispering." Lucy adjusted a line, then stepped toward the door. "I'll give you a minute," she said. "If he starts crawling out of bed, hit the red button. If he stops breathing, hit it twice." The door whispered shut behind her. Grace wrapped her fingers around the bed rail. The metal felt the same as every other rail in the building. Her hand tightened on it anyway. She watched Ethan breathe, counted each rise. Her own breath fell into the same rhythm before she realized it. The way it used to when she sat beside wounded men in canvas tents, matching her breathing to theirs so she could tell the moment something changed. His eyelids fluttered. One lifted halfway. A sliver of hazel appeared, blurred and unfocused. "You're supposed to be asleep," she said quietly. He made a sound between a sigh and a groan. "Not good at that," he murmured. The words were slow, shaped around sedation like someone speaking through water. "You just got your shoulder opened and your chest poked," she said. "You could try cooperating for once in your life." He focused a bit more, found the shape of her face above him. "You stayed," he said. 3 syllables. They carried more weight than 3 syllables should be allowed to hold. "I work here," she replied. "You know what I mean." She did. She knew exactly what he meant, and the knowing sat in her chest like a stone she could neither swallow nor spit out. "I'm on borrowed time," she said. 5 minutes according to Lucy. You should use them for something useful." He let his gaze travel around the room. The machines, the low light, the city's dim glow through the glass. Then he brought it back to her. Back to the only thing in the room that mattered to him. "They told us Iron Veil was over," he said. There it was again. The name. She felt the familiar clench, but it was gentler this time. The word had worn a small groove in her defenses tonight, and each pass cut less deep. "It is," she said. "For most people." His fingers moved on the sheet, testing the fabric like a man testing whether the ground beneath him was real. "That suit, Cole, he was here before they rolled me in. Told me command was dusting off files." "That's his name," Grace confirmed. He looked like he wanted 10 different things and didn't want to admit any of them out loud. "That sounds about right." "He asked me about you," Ethan said. "Asked if the person who whispered into my head tonight was the same one who dragged us across that courtyard when everything was falling apart. He swallowed, his throat moved with effort. I told him yes, in case you were wondering. She was. She wouldn't have admitted it under oath, but she was. He showed me a paper, she said. Your name on it, mine underneath, under a heading I didn't expect to see again. Ethan's eyes cleared another fraction. You didn't, he said, or you didn't want to. Both, she said. He watched her. His gaze was heavier now, not just sedation, but the weight of 5 years of believing something that had just been proven wrong. You left, he said. I don't blame you. You stayed, she said. I don't blame you either. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full, thick with things that had been carried alone for too long by two people who had survived the same night and spent every night since then remembering different versions of how it ended. I woke up in Germany with a tube in my throat, Ethan said after a long moment. They told me the roof went. They told me Carter and Russ didn't make it. He said their names carefully, laying each one down in the space between them, like something fragile. They told me the medic went with them. No survivors on that floor besides me. His voice dropped. That's the version I've had in my head every single time I think about that night. Grace looked at the bandage on his shoulder. Clean edges, neat sutures, the opposite of the way Carter and Russ had vanished from the world. Your version worked for what you needed, she said. He shook his head against the pillow. Not much, just enough. My version gave me a ghost to salute, he said, not a person. Her grip on the rail tightened until her knuckles went white. You did that? She asked. A salute? Every year, he said, a few of us would get together. What was left? We drink something too strong, raise glasses, say names. He paused. Yours was near the top. Grace stood very still. The image settled over her. A dim bar somewhere, men with hollowed-out eyes, softened at the edges by time, but never fully healed. Her name in their mouths like a ritual, a toast to a woman they believe was buried under rubble on the other side of the world. I don't know what to do with that, she admitted. You keep breathing, he said. That's step one. Very original advice. You want creativity, you shouldn't have let me get blown up twice in one night. She almost smiled. His hand lying near the edge of the blanket moved, not quite reaching, but close. She lifted hers and rested it on the rail just above his fingers. The space between them stayed intact, but it was bridged now, thin as a wire and just as strong. Lucy's knock came soft through the door. Time, she said. Grace nodded. She let go of the rail slowly. Her hand felt lighter afterward, as if she'd been holding something heavier than metal and bone. She stepped back from the bed. Ethan's eyes had closed. His breathing was deeper. The monitor held steady. How is he? Lucy asked from the doorway. Stubborn, Grace said. That's usually a good sign up here. Grace looked at him one last time. The bandages, the tubes, the rise and fall of a chest that had almost stopped rising an hour ago. Then she turned and walked into the hallway, where the lights were a little brighter and the air tasted like nothing at all, and the weight of everything that had just passed between them settled into her bones like something that had always been there and was only now willing to admit its name. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Grace leaned against the wall. Her reflection stared back from the brushed metal. Tired eyes, tight jaw, scrubbed top wrinkled where she'd pressed the envelope against her chest. She looked like a woman who had run a marathon inside a building and never left the hallway. The doors opened on the ground floor, and the ER rushed back in. Noise, movement, the smell of coffee and disinfectant, and someone's burned toast from the cafeteria. She stepped out and walked toward the nurse's station on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She checked the board. New names had appeared while she was upstairs. A possible appendicitis, a laceration, a teenager with a dislocated shoulder. The ordinary River. She folded herself back in and let work do what work had always done for her. Fill her hands, fill her head, Give her something with a beginning and an end that didn't involve dust or fire or the sound of a building swallowing people she loved. She was double-checking a dosage at the computer when she felt it. That prickle at the back of her neck, the same one she'd felt before Cole appeared the first time. The sense of being watched by someone who already knew the answers to questions they hadn't asked yet. She finished entering the order before she looked up. Cole Everett stood at the far corner of the station. He'd traded his suit jacket for a dark cardigan, but the badge at his belt hadn't changed. The combination was strange, less formal, not softer, like a weapon with a different grip. "You really do work, don't you?" he said. "Some people pretend not to notice," she replied. "I was briefed on the difference between civilian nursing and combat medicine," he said. Nobody mentioned paperwork was the common thread. She closed the chart. "Are you here for him or for me?" "Both," Cole said, "not at the same time." Marta appeared from nowhere, glanced between them, made an adjustment to the whiteboard that definitely didn't need adjusting, and announced she was going to check on bed 5. She vanished down the hall with a speed that suggested she'd been practicing the exit. "You have friends," Cole observed. "I have coworkers," Grace said. "Some would argue there's overlap." He looked around the station, then back at her. "Do you have anywhere in this place that passes for private?" "Break room," she said. "If nobody's crying in there." Nobody was. The room was small, 2 tables, a fridge that hummed like it was thinking about quitting, a microwave with a sticky door, and a poster about hand hygiene that was peeling at one corner. Cole took a chair and set a thin folder on the table lengthwise, aligning it with invisible lines on the surface. Grace sat across from him. "I promised you a conversation," he said. "You promised me context," she replied. "Same thing." He tapped the folder with 2 fingers. "This is the after-action summary for Operation Iron Veil, the one you never read." Grace pulled her chair closer. The legs scraped against the floor. "They told me everything I needed to know when I signed my discharge," she said. "Did they?" "They told me I was found with blast injuries and multiple concussions. They told me the building collapsed. They told me I was lucky to be alive." "Lucky," Cole repeated, "is a generous word." "They told me the team took heavy losses," she added, "which I already knew." Cole opened the folder. Inside, a few pages clipped together. Some lines blacked out with redaction markers. Others left intact, neat type that turned chaos into bullet points and short sentences. The bureaucratic language of catastrophe. He slid the top page between them. "You know what it felt like," he said. "This is what it looked like on the other side." Grace's eyes dropped to the paper. Her name was there in the personnel list. So were the others: Mercer, Carter, Mills, Reyes, Russ. She read ahead. "Contact initiated at target structure. First detonation. Structural compromise upper levels. Evacuation ordered. Second detonation. Stairwell collapse." Her pulse picked up. She could feel it in her throat, in the tips of her fingers, in the space behind her eyes. "Carter," she said. Cole turned the page. There it was. Carter, RKIA. Cause: structural impact during initial blast, upper corridor. Body unrecovered due to instability of sight. Her vision narrowed. The words blurred, then sharpened. She swallowed against the thickness in her throat. "Russ?" she asked. Cole flipped further. He tapped a paragraph halfway down and read aloud. "Corpsman Dalton ordered to withdraw injured personnel from upper level. Sergeant Russell remained in position to cover retreat, held corridor against advancing hostiles until third detonation." He paused. "They included quotes from surviving witnesses," he said. "That's unusual. They don't always do that." He turned the page so she could see it. A section near the bottom held lines in a different font. Pieces pasted from other reports, other voices, other people who had been there and lived to say what they saw. Cole read the first one. "Last visual. Sergeant Russell physically pushed HM2 Dalton toward exit. Verbal order recorded on comms. That's an order. Move. The words hit Grace like a fist she'd been expecting for 3 years, but had never braced for properly. The same words she heard every night when the apartment got quiet and the dark got heavy, and her mind went back to that hallway without asking her permission. "I heard him," she said. Her voice came out flat and stripped. "I just decided it was the wrong choice." Cole exhaled softly. From his side, it looks different. He read the next quote. "Without Dalton moving, Sergeant Mercer and Mills do not clear the structure before collapse. Multiple survivors credit Dalton with dragging them past last stable wall." Grace stared at the words. "Dragged is a very generous verb," she said. "There was a lot of stumbling." "The floor didn't file a complaint," Cole replied. He let the silence sit, didn't rush to fill it, didn't try to steer. He just sat there with his hands folded on the table and let the weight of the paper do its work. "What are you trying to do?" Grace asked finally. "Prove that a report can make it sound clean?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to make sure you know the version that made it into the archive isn't the one where you failed everyone." She looked up at him. His eyes were steady. No pity, no manipulation. Just the calm, measured gaze of a man who had read too many of these files and recognized the pattern in the person sitting across from him. "In their version," Cole continued, "you followed a direct order under impossible conditions and got as many people out as physics allowed. You didn't abandon anyone. You didn't decide who lived." "I left him," she said. The words dropped out of her mouth like stones, heavy, final. The same words she'd been carrying since the night it happened, polished smooth by repetition, worn into the shape of a truth she'd built her entire civilian life around. "No," Cole said. "He chose to stay. He didn't get to live with that choice." "That's true," Cole replied. "You did, which is why you twisted it until it sat on your chest instead of his." Her jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. "You sound very sure," she said. "I read a lot of reports," he answered. "I listened to how people talk about themselves in the years after. There are patterns." He unfolded his hands and laid them flat on the table. "One pattern is this. The people who had no choices blame themselves the most. The ones who had plenty sometimes blame everyone else." "Which one am I?" she asked. "You had one choice," he said. "Stay and die in a hallway that was already coming down. Or move and try to keep a pulse in anyone you could reach." He tilted his head toward the paper. "The record says you chose option 2. She let out a breath. It trembled at the end. A small, almost invisible shudder that she caught and killed before it could become something larger. "And you?" she asked. "What did you choose?" "An office 3 buildings away in a country with central heating," Cole said. His voice carried no pride, no shame, just fact. "I wasn't there. I saw it through feeds and transcripts, which is exactly why I keep the words from the people who were." He tapped the quote again. "He ordered you out," Cole said. "Russ did the math in his head that you keep doing in yours. And he put himself on the side of the equation he knew he wasn't walking away from." He leaned back slightly. "You don't have to like that," he added. "You just have to recognize that you didn't overwrite his choice." Grace sat very still. Something inside her had the feeling of a door that had been barred for a very long time. The wood warped around the lock. The hinges rusted shut. Now, under pressure from both sides, from Cole's words and Ethan's whisper, and the hiss of air through a needle, and the weight of a name on a piece of paper, it creaked. Not open. Not yet. But no longer sealed. "He died," she said. "Yes," Cole said. "They nearly did," she added. "Ethan, Mills, Reyes." "And they didn't," Cole said, "because you moved." She looked down at the paper, at her own name. Dalton, Grace M., status, survived. The line had been corrected recently. A note in the margin marked the change from presumed KIA to present. Fresh ink over old assumption. She noticed something else, a small star penciled next to her name. "What's that?" she asked. Cole followed her gaze. "Anchor," he said. The word sat between them like something with its own gravity. "You use that word in the hallway," she said. "You said people pay attention to their anchors." He nodded. "In messy operations," he said, "certain individuals become points we tie our understanding to. You pull 6 people out of a collapse, you become one of those points." "That doesn't obligate me to be anything now," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't obligate you. It does explain why your reappearance has people above my desk rearranging their expectations." She closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "So that's what this is," she said. "Expectations." "Acknowledgement," he said. "And yes, expectation." He didn't dress it up. He didn't soften the edges. "You have options, more than you think." "Such as?" "You can stay exactly where you are," he said. "Work your shifts, take care of sprains and codes. Go home, sleep, repeat. Nobody's going to drag you back into a uniform." He set his hand on the folder. "Or," he said, "you can let us formally recognize what you clearly still carry." "Recognize how?" "Advisory roles, training, tactical medicine instruction." He met her eyes. "You already did half a workshop in that CT suite." Grace thought of Jamie's face when the needle went in. She thought of the resident scribbling on his glove. She thought of Lang's hands on the defibrillator paddles, about to deliver a shock that would have killed a heart that was begging for help, not electricity. "We have young teams rotating through scenarios based on reports like this one," Cole continued, tapping the folder. "They learn from sanitized versions. You could help unsanitize them, make them real, without putting yourself on a plane." The idea landed in her chest and sat there. Not sharp, not comfortable, heavy, the way a decision is heavy before you make it and lighter after you do. She pictured a room, mannequins on tables, whiteboards with diagrams, her voice explaining blast patterns and tension signs, and the difference between a heart that's dying and a heart that's being crushed by the air around it. Young faces looking at her the way Jamie had looked at her, the way the resident with the marker had looked. Not with pity, with hunger. The hunger of people who want to know what they don't know before it costs someone their life. "I still work here," she said. "You can do both," Cole said. "Or neither. I'm not a recruiter, I'm a messenger. You brought me a file and a status I didn't ask for. And I'm telling you what some people hope you might be willing to do with them," he replied. He spread his hands slightly. "You get to decide. That's more than some people got." That last sentence sat in the room like a gravestone. She thought of Carter, of Russ, of nights in sand and concrete and the smell of blood that never washed out of certain memories, no matter how many years of soap you threw at them. "What if I say no?" she asked. "Then we adjust our maps," Cole said, "and you go back to your board and your patience and your life." "What if I say yes?" "Then we schedule conversations in smaller rooms than this one," he said, "with people who have more paperwork than I do." She almost smiled at the picture. Rooms full of binders and acronyms and the particular strain of government coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in 1987 and never quite gotten over it. He stood, picking up the folder. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said. "You've had enough new information for one shift." She stood too. "You seem very sure I'm not going to tear that envelope up," she said. He looked at her pocket. "You put it away," he said. "Not in the trash." He opened the door, then paused. His hand rested on the frame and something in his posture changed. The professional filter dropped by 1 degree, revealing something underneath that was harder to name, but easier to trust. "For what it's worth," he said, "the men whose names are blacked out on that page didn't talk about you like a mistake." He met her eyes. "They talked about you like a reason they were still breathing long enough to write the report." Then he stepped out and walked away down the corridor. Grace stood alone in the break room. The fridge hummed. The vending machine in the corner rattled softly as its compressor kicked on. The poster about hand hygiene peeled another millimeter from the wall. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope. The paper was warm now from her body heat. She didn't open it. She didn't need to read the words again. They were already written somewhere behind her eyes, carved into a space that reports and redactions couldn't reach. Reactivated. Anchor. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she opened her bag, the one sitting on the break room chair where she dropped it at the start of her shift, a lifetime ago, and slid the envelope inside. Not in her pocket where it pressed against her with every step. Not in the trash where it would stop existing. In her bag. Kept. Carried. Decided upon. She turned off the break room light and walked back to the station. The rest of the night moved in fits and starts. She checked vitals, changed dressings, reassured the teenager with a dislocated shoulder that his arm would work again. She watched the clock's hands crawl toward the edge of her shift. Every so often, she called upstairs. Lucy answered both times. The first call, stable. The second, he's asking for coffee, and I told him no, which I consider a positive sign. The sky outside the narrow ER windows softened from black to charcoal. Night shift and morning shift overlapped in a tangle of handoffs and complaints. Grace finished charting her last case and logged out. She was heading toward the locker room when Marta caught her sleeve. "Hold up," Marta said, "before you vanish into vending machine breakfast." "What now?" "Field trip," Marta said. "I've had enough of those for a lifetime. This one has better lighting and fewer explosions." Marta jerked her chin toward the elevators. "He wants to see you." Plural. Lang asked for trauma staff. Park waved his hands and said something about teachable moments. I stopped listening, but there's coffee. "Do I have a choice?" "You always have a choice," Marta said. "You also have about 10 people upstairs who watched a man try to climb off an operating table when your name was mentioned. They want the visual to go with the legend." "Legend? That's excessive. Tell that to the resident who tried to draw your decompression technique on a napkin. Come on, you look like you could use a chair that isn't in a hallway." In the end, it was easier to go with the current. They stepped into the elevator with 2 residents, a respiratory tech, and Darius, the security officer who'd sprinted into trauma 2 hours ago with a granola bar in his hand. His name tag caught the light. He avoided Grace's eyes until the doors closed, then looked up. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "About letting go of his arm," Darius said. "He didn't swing at me after that." There was relief in his voice. And something else, the quiet pride of a man who had been part of something he didn't fully understand but knew mattered. "Thank you for not tasing my patient," Grace said. He huffed a short laugh. "Wasn't on my top 5 list of things to do tonight." The doors opened on the 3rd floor. Lucy stood outside room 7 with a clipboard. "You brought half the ER," she said. "Lang said team," Marta replied. "This is the short version." Through the glass, Grace could see movement. Ethan propped up. More awake. Fewer tubes. The oxygen still there, but the man underneath it looking more like a person and less like a collection of injuries trying to decide which one would win. Cole stood near the foot of the bed. He'd switched back to the jacket. He caught sight of the group and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said. They filed in. Nurses. Residents. Darius with his hands tucked carefully at his sides. Even Lang appeared at the last moment, slipping in with a coffee cup and a stiff set to his shoulders that said someone had dragged him here by professional obligation, and he was not entirely ungrateful. Ethan looked up. His eyes blinked. Cleared. "Morning," he said, voice rough but stronger than it had any right to be. His gaze found Grace in the cluster almost immediately. It skimmed past Lang, past Jamie, past every face he didn't know, and locked onto hers like his eyes had been tracking her through walls and floors and elevator shafts the entire night. "You're popular," he said. "Most of them came for the coffee," she replied. Jamie coughed to cover a smile. Cole moved to the side of the bed and made a small gesture with his hand. "Captain Mercer asked to address the team," he said. "I told him we could gather some of you. You outperformed the sample size." Lang took a sip of his coffee. "This is irregular," he said. "Most worthwhile things are," Cole replied. Ethan shifted, grimacing as his shoulder reminded him it existed. He adjusted until he found a position that didn't pull on sutures. He looked tired, pale around the edges, but there was a focused steadiness in his gaze that carried straight into his voice. "I'm not great at speeches," he said. "That's fine," Marta said. "We're great at pretending to listen." A low ripple of laughter moved through the room. It loosened the tension by one notch. Ethan let the corner of his mouth lift. "Fair," he said. "I'll keep it short." He looked at Lang first. "You cut me open," he said. "You put things back where they belonged. I don't take that for granted." Lang shifted, caught off guard by the direct acknowledgement. "It's what I do," he said. "You did it well," Ethan replied. His gaze moved to Jamie. "You," he said. "Thank you for not letting protocol kill me." Jamie's ears turned pink. "I almost did," he said. "She told me not to." He tipped his head toward Grace. Ethan's eyes followed, and stayed. "Which brings me to the main point," he said. The room went quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of people leaning in without meaning to. "When I woke up downstairs," Ethan said, "I wasn't here. I was halfway back in a place that didn't have clean floors or bright lights. I didn't know any of your faces. I didn't care about your names." He took a breath. "Then someone said 6 words that shouldn't mean anything to anyone in this building, except me." He looked at Grace. "Viper 3, Echo Fall." The sound vibrated against the glass, against the machines, against the chests of every person standing in that room. "No one here is supposed to know that phrase," he went on. "It's tied to one night, one mess, one set of people." He paused. "One medic." Grace felt every eye shift her way. "I spent 5 years believing that medic died," Ethan said. "We carved her name on a wall. We saluted her when we met. We raised glasses and told stories about how she yelled at us while dragging us away from bad decisions." A ghost of a grin touched his mouth. Then it faded into something raw. "Turns out," he said, "we were toasting the wrong thing." He pushed himself more upright. Lucy moved to adjust the pillows without being asked, finding the angle that let him sit without tearing anything. He lifted his left arm, the good one. IV lines, tape on the back of his hand. He moved slowly, every inch deliberate, every inch costing him something. Every person in that room who had ever worn a uniform, past or present, knew what he was about to do before his hand reached his brow. He saluted. It wasn't regulation perfect. His shoulders shook. His fingers trembled. The hospital gown took something away from the formality. None of that mattered. He held the salute with his eyes locked on Grace, and his voice came out clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "For the record," he said, "this hospital didn't save my life tonight." He let the words hang. "Grace Dalton did." Silence. Thick. Absolute. The kind that presses against your skin and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The monitor seemed to soften its beep, as if even the machines understood that sound would break something important. Grace felt heat crawl up her throat. Not embarrassment, something older. Something that had been buried under 3 years of quiet apartments and new staff stickers, and the careful, deliberate work of pretending to be someone who had never crawled through rubble with another person's blood on her hands. Her instinct screamed at her to step back, to slide behind the others, to let the moment pass over her head the way she'd let so many moments pass. Unacknowledged, unclaimed, unfelt. She didn't move. Her spine straightened, her hands unfolded at her sides. Her gaze met Ethan's and held it with everything she had left. She raised her hand, not to her brow, not a mirrored salute. She lifted it halfway, fingers open, palm angled toward him. An acknowledgement, not of rank, of something deeper, of recognition, of 2 people who had walked through the same fire and come out on different sides of the same scar. Ethan dropped his hand, exhaled. Marta wiped at the corner of one eye and pretended something had gotten in it. Darius's jaw worked like he was swallowing something he didn't trust himself to say. Jamie looked at Grace with an expression that would stay with him for years. The kind of look you give someone when you realize the person standing next to you has been carrying a weight you can't imagine, and they never once asked you to help hold it. Lang set his coffee down. The sound was small and deliberate. "I owe you an apology," he said. The words came out abrupt, as if they'd been sitting behind his teeth all night, pressing against the backs of his molars, waiting for any crack wide enough to escape through. Grace turned her head toward him. "For assuming your experience based on your badge," he said. "For nearly overriding you when I should have been listening." The admission cost him. That was obvious, but it landed with a weight that shifted the room. "You didn't know," she said. "I didn't ask," he replied. He ran his thumb along the seam of his coffee cup. "If you're willing," he went on, "I'd like you to help us review our trauma protocols. There are gaps between what we think we know and what you've seen." Grace felt the attention settle on her. She thought of Cole's folder, the word anchor, the envelope in her bag. Ethan's salute still hanging in the air like something that refused to fade. "If we do that," she said slowly, "we do it together. Every badge, every shift level. No more assuming the quiet ones have nothing to add." Jamie nodded immediately. "Deal," he said. Lucy raised her hand from the other side of the bed. "Agreed." Darius tilted his head in assent, and Lang, after one beat that lasted longer than it needed to, gave a small, firm nod that cost him another piece of the armor he'd spent 20 years building. Ethan settled back against his pillows. His eyes were heavier now. The burst of energy that had carried him through the salute was draining, and what was left was a man who had been shot and blown up and operated on, and was finally, reluctantly, letting his body win the argument about rest. "That's my cue to pass out," he said. "You're finally taking my advice," Grace said. "Don't get used to it." She let herself smile, just enough for him to see. Lucy clapped her hands softly. "Visiting time is over," she said. "This is still an ICU, not a theater." People filed out. Grace lingered one moment longer at the side of the bed. Ethan's eyes had already closed. His breathing was easing into a pattern that sounded less like survival and more like sleep. She didn't touch him. She just watched, let the image fix itself in a place where it could stay, not as a memory of a man she'd lost, but as proof of a man she'd kept. Then she turned and walked into the hallway, where the light was brighter, and the air was different, and something that had been carried alone for 3 years by two people had finally been set down in a room full of witnesses who would remember what it sounded like when it landed. The ICU doors closed behind them with a soft, hydraulic sigh. For a moment, the group lingered in the hallway. People shifted, cleared throats, tried to decide whether to crack one more joke or let the quiet stand. A pager went off down the corridor and broke the pause, and duty pulled everyone back to their own corners of the hospital. "Back to the mines," Marta said, stretching her shoulders. "Come on, Dalton, before someone realizes we're loitering without a patient." They took the elevator down together. The ride was silent, but the silence felt different now, less like something sitting on their chests, more like a collective exhale that nobody wanted to interrupt. The doors opened on the ER. Day shift had fully taken hold. Marta peeled off toward a crying toddler. Darius headed for the security desk. Jamie stopped at the board to argue with another resident about consult assignments. The machine kept running. It always did. Grace found herself back at the nurse's station. Lang stood there sorting through a stack of forms. He looked up when she approached. "Dalton," he said, neutral, careful. "Doctor," she replied. He set the forms down. "I'm serious about the protocols," he said. "We build them on what we know. Your framework is wider in areas mine doesn't cover." She thought of the CT suite, his hands on the defibrillator paddles, the whine of a charge that would have stopped a heart instead of saving it. "I can bring a few ideas," she said. You can bring more than that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a copied blank of the hospital's trauma intake checklist. He slid it across the counter to her. "Start here," he said. "Write what you'd want to see on this if you were the one coming through the doors with half a building still in your lungs." His eyes held hers. The arrogance was still there. It was part of his operating system and always would be. But underneath it, something had rearranged itself. A wall had developed a crack, and through that crack, respect was leaking in, whether he liked it or not. "I'll listen," he added, "even if I don't like all of it." That, Grace knew, was no small promise from a man like Victor Lang. She nodded. "I'll think about it," she said. He grunted and stepped away, already halfway into his next case before his shoes had carried him 10 feet down the hall. Grace unfolded the checklist. The boxes and headings sat in neat rows. Airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure, standard trauma protocol. The same checklist used in emergency departments across the country. She saw the gaps immediately. The places where another line could go. Blast pattern indicators, rapid assessment of tension signs, behavioral cues for combat-related flashback, de-escalation before sedation. She folded the paper again and tucked it into her pocket next to the ghost of the envelope. Her shift ended 20 minutes later. Marta waved her off with a firm hand. "Go home. Before someone remembers you can start IVs in your sleep." "I can't," Grace said. "You could," Marta answered. "Don't tempt fate." Grace washed her hands one last time. The warm water ran over her knuckles and between her fingers, washing away traces of a night that had started with a storm and ended with a salute. She changed in the locker room, scrubs traded for jeans and a worn sweatshirt that smelled like laundry detergent and the particular loneliness of a woman who lived alone and rarely noticed until moments like this. Her badge went into her bag. The envelope rustled faintly when it shifted against the fabric. Outside, the air was cooler than it had been during the storm. The sky had lightened to pale gray, washed thin with clouds that didn't have the energy to rain again. The parking lot glistened in spots where puddles still clung to the low points in the asphalt. She crossed to her car. The engine turned over on the first try. The drive was short. Houston slid past the windows in familiar chunks. Overpass, strip mall, a small park with water drops still hanging on the swings. Her apartment building was plain brick, 3 stories, a narrow stairwell that always carried the scent of someone else's cooking. She climbed to the second floor and unlocked her door. Quiet, the kind that waited rather than pressed. She dropped her bag on the chair by the door and stood still for a moment, listening to the absence of monitors. Her body expected noise. When none came, her shoulders dropped 3 inches. She went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, drank half in one go, leaned against the counter and let the night replay in pieces she couldn't control. Ethan on the gurney, fighting ghosts, her own voice saying words she'd sworn she'd buried forever. The hiss of air leaving his chest through a needle she'd driven between his ribs. The look in his eyes when he realized she wasn't dead. Cole's folder on the break room table. The quotes about Russ, about orders, about math done inside a collapsing building by a man who'd known exactly what the answer would cost him. The salute. She set the glass down and went to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, reached underneath until her fingers found the familiar cardboard edge. The box scraped softly as she pulled it out. Not large. The lid had been taped and retaped over the years. She'd written nothing on the outside. It didn't need a label. She knew what lived inside it, the way you know where a scar is without looking. She sat cross-legged on the floor and peeled the tape back. Inside were things she hadn't touched in a long time. A folded uniform shirt, faded at the seams. The patch with a small red cross, edges frayed where it had been torn free in a hurry. A name tape, Dalton, stitched in dark letters that had once been pressed against her chest every day for years. A worn black bracelet, simple, elastic, threaded through a small metal tag. She picked it up and turned it over. Initials on the tag: C-R-R-H. Carter. Russ. She ran her thumb over each letter. The metal was cool, solid. It didn't care how long it had been sitting in a box under a bed in Houston, Texas. It remembered what it was. Beneath the bracelet, a stack of photographs, grainy shots of faces in bad lighting, dust and laughter caught on film, a helmet perched at an angle that had once made her roll her eyes across a tent, an arm thrown over a shoulder, men and women with tired eyes and crooked smiles who didn't know that some of them wouldn't make it home. She let herself look at each one. There was Carter, that grin, crooked, wide, the kind that made you want to punch him and hug him at the same time. He'd given her that grin 3 seconds before the first blast. 3 seconds. She'd counted them so many times the number had worn smooth in her mind. There was Russ, standing by a wall with his arms crossed, looking at something off camera with an expression that said he'd already calculated every possible outcome and wasn't impressed by any of them. That was how she remembered him most. Not the last moment, the hand on her vest, the voice that left no room for argument, the 5 words that had saved her life and ended his. She remembered him like this: calm, certain, alive. There was Mills, Reyes, others whose faces she could name, but whose voices had faded to echoes she could no longer quite catch. And in the bottom corner of one photograph, she spotted herself, half-turned, mouth open as if mid-command, a roll of bandage in her hand. The medic caught in the act of telling someone to hold still, stop bleeding, and listen to her, possibly all at once. She had been younger then, not just in years, in the weight she carried behind her eyes. The woman in that photograph didn't know yet what was coming. Didn't know about the building, or the stairwell, or the sound a roof makes when it decides to become a grave. Grace held the photograph between her fingers for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and took out the envelope. The paper was creased now where she'd folded it, warm from being pressed against her body for hours. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The words were carved into a place that paper couldn't reach. She placed the envelope in the box, on top of the photographs, under the bracelet, sliding it into a space that had been empty until today, a gap between the old life and the new one that she hadn't known was waiting to be filled. The old and the new sat together without protest, the uniform and the envelope, the bracelet and the status change, Carter's grin in Cole's folder, Russ's voice and the sound of air hissing through a needle in a CT suite in Houston. She rested her hands on the edge of the box. Her palms felt warm, connected. The medic and the nurse, the ghost and the woman who walked fluorescent floors. They had always been the same person. She had just spent a very long time pretending they weren't. She closed the lid gently. No tape this time. When she pushed the box back under the bed, it went easily, as if it knew it might come out again soon, as if it was tired of being sealed. Back in the living room, she sank onto the couch. Her body ached in all the places it always did after a shift. Shoulders, lower back, the space behind her eyes. But underneath the ache was something else, something lighter. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath underwater for so long that you forgot you were doing it. And then you break the surface and the air hits your lungs and you realize how close you came to not coming back up. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up. Unknown number, but the area code was familiar. She opened the message. From Cole Everett, Captain Mercer's afternoon update. Vitals improving. Arm function expected with time and therapy. Also, he's still asking for coffee. A second line appeared as she watched. Separate note. If you decide to scribble on that checklist Lang gave you, I'd be interested in seeing a copy. Grace stared at the words. Her thumbs hovered over the screen. She typed, noted. Then, after a beat, tell him he can have coffee when his heart agrees. 3 dots pulsed. Cole's reply came back fast. I'll pass along the condition. Welcome back to the board, Dalton. She set the phone down. Welcome back to the board. 4 words that shouldn't have meant anything. She wasn't back on any board. She was a civilian nurse with a red sticker on her badge, and a box under her bed, and an apartment that smelled like laundry detergent. She wasn't a corpsman. She wasn't HM2. She wasn't the woman who crawled through rubble and held arteries shut with her bare hands while the sky fell in. Except she was. She had always been. The apartment was quiet, but inside that quiet she could hear something she hadn't heard in 3 years. Not rotors, not explosions, not the frantic alarm of a monitor coding in a scanner. A steady, measured beat. Her own heart, not racing, not flat, just present, holding its line the way it had held its line through every night since the one that should have killed her. She sat there for a long time. Let her muscles unwind. Let her mind drift. Let her breath come and go without trying to control it, or count it, or match it to someone else's rhythm. When she finally stood, the day had shifted. Light moved differently through the windows. The clouds had thinned. A patch of lighter sky showed through. Not quite blue, but close. The color of a promise that hadn't been made yet, but was thinking about it. She grabbed a pen from the kitchen counter, pulled the folded trauma checklist from her pocket, smoothed it flat on the table. The paper looked small. The boxes looked neat. The headings sat in their rows. Airway, breathing, circulation, disability, exposure. Like soldiers standing at attention, waiting for someone to tell them what they were missing. She uncapped the pen. Next to breathing, she wrote 3 words in neat, firm letters. Watch for tension. Her hand did not shake. She paused, read what she'd written, then moved down the page and added another line, further below, in the margin next to circulation. Listen before you shock. The pen tip scratched lightly against the paper. A small sound, the smallest sound she'd made all night compared to the things she'd said and done. The 6 syllables, the needle, the voice that stopped a man in mid-swing and brought him back from a country that existed only in his head. But this sound mattered too, maybe more, because the words she'd spoken tonight would fade. The needle had done its work and been disposed of. The salute had landed and been received. But these words on paper, these would teach. These would travel. These would sit in the hands of residents and nurses and surgeons who would never know about Operation Iron Veil or Viper Team or a building with white walls that folded in on itself one ugly night in a valley that didn't appear on any public map. They wouldn't know the story, but they'd learn the lesson. Watch for tension. Listen before you shock. She put the pen down and looked at what she'd written. It was not a full protocol. It was not a complete map. It was a start. The kind you make when you know the terrain is rough and the weather is unpredictable, but you've walked it before and you're willing, finally, to admit that means something. She thought about Ethan upstairs in his hospital bed, breathing under soft light, his arms still attached, his heart still beating. She thought about Jamie, who would never again look at a tension pneumothorax without remembering the night a nurse in a red sticker taught him the difference between a dying heart and a drowning one. She thought about Lang, who had handed her a blank checklist and told her to fill in what he couldn't see, and meant it. She thought about Carter's grin, 3 seconds before the blast. She thought about Russ in the doorway. 5 words. That's an order. Move. She thought about the bracelet in the box under her bed. CRRH. 2 sets of initials that would never add new stories. 2 men who had made their choices and lived, or died, by the math they'd done in their heads, in the time it takes a building to fall. And she thought about herself. Grace Dalton, HM2, doc, nurse, ghost, anchor. A woman who had survived the worst night of her life and spent 3 years apologizing for it by pretending it had happened to someone else. It hadn't. It had happened to her. All of it. The blood and the dust and the fire and the screaming and the silence that came after, which was always worse than the screaming. The dragging of bodies through doorways. The impossible choices that weren't really choices at all, but the only thing left when everything else had been taken away. It had happened to her, and she had walked out of it alive. Not because she was lucky, not because she was special, because a man named Russ had shoved her toward an exit and held a corridor alone so she could drag the others through. Because she had moved when he told her to move. Because she had kept her hands on the wounded and her feet on the stairs, and her voice in the ears of men who needed to hear someone say, "Keep going, we're almost there, I've got you, don't you dare stop now." She had done that. Not a ghost, not a file, not a name on a wall or a toast at the bottom of a glass. Her, Grace Dalton, present tense, breathing, standing, writing on a piece of paper at a kitchen table in Houston, Texas, with the sun working its way through the clouds. She folded the checklist along its creases and set it on the counter where she would see it in the morning. Then she went to the window and looked out at the city. The streets below glistened from last night's rain. The world looked washed, clean in the way things look clean after a storm has passed through and taken the worst of itself somewhere else. Her reflection hovered in the glass. Tired eyes, hair still pulled back from the shift, jaw set in a line that had carried her through a night she'd remember for the rest of her life. For a moment, just one, she thought she could see another version of herself standing behind the first. Helmet, vest, dust on her cheeks, bandage in her hand, mouth open mid-command. They didn't cancel each other out. They never had. One had built the other. One had bled so the other could heal. And now, for the first time since the night the building came down, they were looking in the same direction. Grace turned from the window. She didn't go to bed. She wasn't tired, or she was, but the kind of tired that wouldn't be fixed by sleep. It would be fixed by something else, by time, by work, by filling in blank lines on a checklist and walking back into a hospital tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, carrying what she carried, knowing what she knew, and no longer pretending that the weight was someone else's. She picked up her phone one more time, scrolled to Cole's number, typed 4 words. "I'll do it." Both. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. His reply came 30 seconds later, a single line. "Good. They'll be glad to hear it." She set the phone face down on the table, sat back, let out a long breath that started somewhere deep in her chest and traveled all the way out to the tips of her fingers before it let go. Outside, the clouds parted another inch. Light spilled through, pale gold, thin but steady, the kind of light that doesn't announce itself but shows up anyway and stays. Grace Dalton had spent 3 years believing she was the woman who left, the woman who walked away, the woman who abandoned a man in a hallway and ran. She wasn't. She was the woman who moved when she was told to move, who dragged the living through the last door, who carried the dead in a box under her bed and the living in a tattoo on her arm, and who walked into a trauma bay on a Thursday night in Houston and saved a life with 6 syllables, 2 steady hands, and the truth she had buried so deep she'd forgotten it was there until a dying man looked at her arm and whispered a name she thought she'd never hear again. She was not a ghost. She was not a file. She was not a line on a list or a toast at the bottom of a glass. She was the reason they made it out, and she was done pretending she wasn't. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story moved you or made you think about the people in your life who carry more than they show, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next story.